pivotal in putting this together. We really are appreciative of your work with the trust, as well as the sort of work that you'll be doing as an art historian at UC Riverside, and really excited to hear more about your work with Michael. David Pagel here as well from Claremont, and renowned writer here in LA, works with a lot of our artists. I've read a lot of your work. Really happy to have you here as well. And then a fellow colleague of Michael, Peter Shelley. Thank you for being here as well, and also a very important LA artist. So to everyone that's here, I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at some of Michael's work, but we're going to have this sort of be a little bit free form, kind of talk about each person's like sort of anecdotal relationship to Michael, start talking about his work. But if you guys have questions as well, at any point in the conversation, feel free to ask questions and contribute. So I think maybe just starting off, if we can maybe just hear a little bit about your guys' individual relationships with Michael, and then maybe some relationship you had to his work, or maybe how you maybe first got involved with working with him.
I know Michael, so we went to the same college, Pomona College, and he graduated about 5 years ahead of me, and I think that his... Everything's okay? Okay. Michael graduated from Claremont Grad School and went off to work in the Midwest, and then came back to replace an ailing David Gray, who was the head of sculpture at Pomona College. So I had Michael my junior year, and we had an immediate affinity, and we worked on, we built this kind of special room that he thought he would use to do one of his sound works in a kind of envelope white space in the back of the sculpture area. And we built this thing together, and I used it to make certain kind of works that I was doing at the time, which had to do with tethering bits of cloth with using string between opposite walls. So you have these kind of floating tensile forms that were in space. And we had I remember one of the experiences we had was Eleanor Anton and David Anton came to visit, and they sort of looked at Michael and said, it's too bad you built this room because it's really not neutral. And I remember Michael and I looking at each other like, I always remember it because both of us afterwards kind of go, oh, please, anyway. But it was, artists who make things, and as ephemeral as Michael's work is, he believed in the experience of art objects, such as it is and diffusive as a sound work would be. He believed that was the primary experience, as opposed to having some long discussion about and he was as interested in the circumstance for the work as he could possibly be, but at the same time, you pull it away, so you're just talking about such basic conditions like, it's too bad you built this space. It was a bonding thing for the two of us to sort of recognize that our respective commitment to, a real sort of experience of a art object, has, even if it's molecules bumping into each other, was a bond. Anyway, Michael was very special to me also because he's similar age to my next oldest brother, and Michael was very kind of brotherly towards me, which I really appreciated. And even though he was trying to figure out a few things in his life, personally at the time, he brought me out to Venice to stay with him for a few days in the studio, and that meant a lot to me too, because it's one thing to take a class from an artist, but if artists are really, as teachers, working around you, it's really special to be around working artists when you're a student. So Michael, very important to me on just a personal level. And he also, just through the years, was just, we stayed very close because he was always just very kind in that way to me. And I know through the years he could be pugnacious with people and kind of bump into people. We just never had that kind of relationship where he just was anything other than just watching out for me. So I miss him a lot, and I'll pass this on to David.
Yeah, I'll pick up with the very last comment you made. So I know Michael best from, he taught at Claremont Graduate University for years and years and years. I also teach there. When I started, I was an adjunct. I'd show up for my class, teach it, and go away. And Michael was always a presence in the building. And then as I became full-time and I'd be out there more, I crossed paths with him quite a lot more with faculty meetings and student evaluations and all that stuff. And I would see him just tear into people. And my first thought was like, glad that's not me. And then as I would watch it, starting as a junior person, where I would keep my mouth shut, and then becoming more experienced there, would kind of participate more. I realized that Michael never went after the weak or the powerless, and Michael would go after people that he thought weren't being serious or taking art serious. So the people that he would let them have it were the people that weren't taking themselves seriously. And to me, he just thought that was like, how could you have this gift of life and presence and consciousness and vision and not do something with it? He was just indignant about that, and let him have it. I was always inspired by Michael because for me, he believed in art with a capital A. And I had a lot of colleagues that thought, like, well, that's old-fashioned and outdated and European and blah, blah, blah. And and for Michael, it wasn't. And that, I think, is because he believed in art with a capital A, but he also believed in anarchy with a capital A. And the art and anarchy went together to me in Michael's philosophy and mine and life, because he never, ever would take anything on authority or on someone else's experience. It was always with Michael about, you have to experience for yourself and then figure it out for yourself and then talk about that. And so for me, that was really powerful, it was empowering, and it was liberating, and it was really art for anyone. That all that mattered with Michael was like, you walk in, you confront the work, whether it's an object, a sound, something ephemeral, and you have an experience of that, and then you have to come to understand your experience. And he was completely open to any kind of artist working in any kind of media, doing any kind of thing, as long as you were paying attention to the details of that. And we became great friends, and I really enjoyed working with him and comparing notes about students. I have lots of little anecdotes about that. Pass it on to another student.
I was about to say, I'm curious.
We didn't talk about you.
You didn't? Okay, I'm glad that's clear. No, I actually knew Michael. I never actually worked with him professionally as a colleague. I was one of his students back in 2002 and 2004, where I was also one of David Pagel's students as well at CGU. And Michael was, out of the faculty I worked with, the only faculty I worked with all 4 semesters I was there, starting in the fall and then throughout my entire 2 years there. And he was also the chair of my committee. And I think this idea that both of you guys talk about the integrity of the work came through. At that time I was a painter, I was not an art historian. And it was interesting because I knew nothing of Michael's artistic practice as a student. He never talked about it, he never said that he worked in sound or that he made rooms, none of that. But he had this ability to come into your studio and go straight to your work and pick out one thing or 2 things about it and address it in a very concrete and sort of thorough way. And I think it was a way of teasing out, is this student really serious or are they just messing around? And he had that ability to kind of get in there. And if you were messing around, he would definitely come in and kind of poke at you. There was a couple of times I had a painting up on the wall that wasn't too good, and he was, Charlie, those hands are terrible. And I'm like, he would get worked up, and at times he'd come in and be very happy with what he saw. As the chair of my committee, he was the one who reviewed my final artist statements. And about 3 years ago, when I was in the process of moving, I was cleaning out this box, and I found the old artist statement that he had edited, and he had edited incredibly aggressively. And he was one of the few editors, I think, that really took the words of the page very seriously. He's like striking things out. It's like, no, you do this, or whatever, and very, very clear and very sort of dedicated in his assertion. So after that point, I did sort of lose contact with him, and then I was able to reconnect with him, thankfully in 2015, where I came to his studio. And at that point, he had sort of transitioned from a young teacher to a senior faculty to sort of I sort of thought of him as sort of like a retired squire living on a hill. And he had a studio, and you would go, and he would talk to you, and he would show you his work, and it was a very sort of nice experience to see him outside of the classroom, and to have him show me that part of his life. That's also where I met Karen at that time. So, and then that was also where I was first made aware of his archive, which is what some of this is from. So,
I was wondering, as a next question, maybe we can talk about how that archive came about and how your relationship as a student and then re-engaging with him in 2015 led to you working with the trust and sort of going through that archive in more depth.
Sure. Josh, are you wanting us to pick this up?
How are you guys doing in terms of hearing this? Mics make a difference? No? It's fine.
It's not because of your recording.
No.
Okay, excuse me. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so what happened, the archive came about after seeing his studio, seeing what was in there. I was not aware of his individual drawings at the time. And my niece at the time, who's not here, she's now back in New York, was attending Sotheby's, and she had talked about catalog resumes. And I was like, oh. And at this point in 2016, Michael had passed away, and I was curious if anybody was looking or working on Michael's stuff, and I made connections with Karen, and Karen very graciously said, yeah, well, what do you got? So I met with Karen and with Lily, and we said we would like to start compiling an archive, and thankfully the two of them had done a good job getting a lot of raw material for us to begin with. And so then it really became a process of going through, figuring out what was in the boxes, figuring out what fell within the parameters of the archive, what did not, because Michael kept everything, personal letters and these things, and you're going through boxes and you're like, that goes over here, you're sorting these things out. And then slowly figuring out how to build that and organize the archive to what it is now. So we went by pieces, and we were just going through, and you'd open up a folder, and it would be receipts from an electrical store from 1970. Michael had kept these things, or a piece of paper with these little dots on it. And when you're first looking at that, I'm like, Michael, what is this, man? And then you keep going back through the archive, and you start to realize he's figuring out how he's arranging his flashers out in the desert, or this is a wiring schematic for one of his pieces that he's building. So it was a learning process of constantly going back and reworking it. And it still yields discoveries today. So, yeah, that's how it came about. And again, it's not finished. It's still in the process of being finalized right now.
Yeah. I wanted to touch back on that. I thought it was an interesting point about art and anarchy, David.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so many artists of that generation were really looking to LA as sort of a blank canvas, and they can kind of challenge things in ways that maybe weren't happening elsewhere, like in Europe and other places. I'm wondering what you think that mentality meant, obviously to Michael, and then how that maybe influenced his work, but also maybe colleagues and artists that were working around at the time, and maybe how you've seen that sort of progress through the years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to me, that at that time, getting sculpture off the pedestal was a really important thing to do if you were a sculptor. And the idea was that the sculptor didn't want the artist to be this thing on a plinth that viewers or visitors were meant to kind of bow down before and look up to. So those artists wanted to get rid of the pedestal. And I think Michael took that let's get rid of the pedestal really, really far. And he, got rid of the object, and it got rid of, but he didn't get rid of the experience. And I think that I really enjoyed telling my colleagues in the other schools at Claremont Graduate University that Michael makes invisible art. And I was wondering what the hell's that? But I think he truly does, and I think he does it not to be sly or clever or witty, but he wanted to make the work that had no barrier, no distance between the viewer and the work. And that's what sound is. I mean, it goes into us before we can, as we experience. So he's not just getting rid of the pedestal, he's getting rid of the space between the sculpture or the work and the recipient, the viewer, the experiencer. And it penetrates us, and it shakes us and moves us, and that's how we feel it inside our very bodies. And I think that intimacy is what his work was really about. And I think a lot of people don't think of sound as an intimate engagement or an intimate experience. But I think that Michael really, really wanted that directness, that immediacy, that merging with our bodies for his work to work in that way. I think a lot of artists wanted it, but I think he took it farther than anyone else. I always think of Brewster and Terrell as kind of like a great 1-2 punch or a team, and Terrell is a lot more famous, but I think Michael's work is actually more radical in that Jim's is there's still something to look at and something pretty to see, and people can kind of get that. But with sound, Michael would show you these 8x10 glossies of an installation. It'd be like not a lot to recommend itself to.
I did see though in the latest catalogs that there is a lot of talk about his thinking about his installations also as visual experiences. And so I know that most commonly, and it's been bounced around as we were putting this show together too. Obviously, was the audible sort of quality of the exhibition, and then also how does that resonate in terms of the feelings? Is that reverberation? I think was important to him.
Like the early standing wave pieces, I think he really did have this idea that you could place the sound, and the quality of sound would actually create a graphic in the room that was palpable. Whether it was an end wall where you get this sort of standing wave, so you'd have sort of troughs and peaks to the sound, or I remember seeing one at Roger Wong's, which was a sound emanated from the ceiling, so it made a kind of somewhat concentric sort of space. I was going to say that I'm from the Midwest, and I grew up in Arizona, so when I came to LA, it was really easy transposition, because it's just like Phoenix and LA are one long run-on of ugliness, interspersed with occasionally like, oh, that's a nice tree, and then, oh my God, here we go, another 6 blocks of the ugliest stuff you've ever seen. Oh, there's a lion in a cage there. Mom, can we stop there to see the lion? Oh, that makes us want to buy a burger, I guess. So things like this. But my observation from the outside is when I came to school and I was a student, as Michael was, and as Chris Burden were students of Maury Baden, I was also a student of Terrell's later. And I think one of the things that happened in LA is you just didn't have this big cultural super ego or big brother. New York was my observation since and then was that it's a big proscenium or a big Cartesian grid that marks off your position relative to the European emigre and everything, all the history there. LA, you say to somebody, well, what do you think of Picasso? And somebody would say, oh yeah, I've seen pictures of him, and I think I saw one of his paintings in the museum. But it wouldn't have the same sort of, it wasn't like William Lieberman creating the entire Museum of Modern Art kind of program, historical program based on Picasso. Here it was sort of like, well, okay, that's pretty good. And also here you didn't have venues for art. So I think artists were also forced to, often not just forced to, they just naturally kind of made their studio into a venue. It became its own kind of envelope for artists to make their work. And you also didn't have this pressure, art historical categories of painting, sculpture, theater, or sound. None of those things sort of existed in a way that made you think, oh, you're stepping into a category that you weren't supposed to be in. And I also think that people naturally kind of relied a lot on their own physical senses because the objectified art object wasn't so clear, and you couldn't. It wasn't like we go into the butterfly club where everybody talks about butterflies. It's like here you would just well, I guess it's kind of a butterfly, but it looks great attached to the back of the truck. So You had it just was, and so in that sense, it was anarchic, and or you just had a lot of kind of confused people, you know. I mean, in my own case, I was really much more committed to a history of art objects, you know, historical objects and so forth. So I was really interested in the kind of sculpture that sometimes you could enter or sometimes would mirror you in some way. But if you took it to the direction of Terrell and Michael, you would just get rid of that objective thing, but then you would still be the object in that space. So, which would have a graphic, and that's one thing that I think he maintained from Maury Dayton, was this sort of concept that the sound would be somatic, you know, like you'd have this kind of physical thing. And I think Michael, early on, a lot of the early sound things were so aggressive in a certain way that they kind of would hurt not just your ears, they would kind of have a body kind of reaction. And you know, and there is, I guess, maybe the CIA explored the idea of certain kinds of sounds that could cause people to be nauseous, you know. So, and he was kind of intense that way early on because I think he really wanted the work not to be picturesque in any way. So later he got to be a little more lyrical with little clickers and little things, you know, and a little softer. Relatively. Anyway, so.
I was going to say, I think that's an interesting point that the venues simply didn't exist here in LA to have the same sort of.
There was nothing.
Right.
There was nothing here, and even in a place like New York, you know, it's like the Exquisite Corpse, or what's the game you play where I tell you something and you tell him,
telephone.
and by the end of the day,
Telephone,
it comes back to you. It's like a giant cultural mosh pit. You know, everybody kind of holds up an idea that has no body. It's just it's something that you transmit verbally to people. And here, everybody's very focused on the idea, even if it was ephemeral, that it had a kind of, you know, and then in that sense, it was also very democratic because you walked in and anybody could get it. And there was the idea that you could communicate the basic substance of the work either visually or through sound. You didn't have to have a footnote or a didact or a cultural reference. So anyway.
I want to pick up on the graphic quality that Peter mentioned, and this is something I wasn't aware of until I talked with Michael. But he would have, say, a piece that had two sound sources, and he would chart out on graph paper how those waves would hit each other and then bounce back and hit each other again. So it wasn't just like this sound wasn't this thing that just passed through something and disappeared. It was something that lingered and interacted, and he would, from all these drawings and the time span, he would create this, you know, like currents of sound bouncing off each other and creating areas, and then you could actually move through it and find somewhere the sound would feel like standing deep in a certain way, and then it was like, oh, it's a little void here, and there's a release over here, and then you think like, shit, I'm part of a walk-in drawing, and it felt, to me, it was like drawing because when I would experience, I didn't want to have colors come with it, but I really felt the structure, the physical structure of all that invisible, empty space. So I found just.
I mean, he spent a lot of time with with the decibel meter, literally plotting out every single little place in a room.
Every cubic foot.
Yeah.
So the S-space drawing, we talked about that too, the decibel.
Well, the thing I actually wanted to build off of what both of you guys said about the attention to building spaces and that sort of DIY aesthetic, but as well as also the sound itself. And the thing I realized is that Michael, he started out working in Pomona and then F-Space, and then he built the sound studio in Venice, and then he built his final studio that he had in Palms. What I thought was interesting was how he was very attuned to how the sound worked within the environment and how the environment worked within the sound. And I thought that he was always trying to bring those two together, and then you, as an activator of the work, would come in and turn the thing on. And so you also, there's a participatory aspect too. I think that was essential that he was able to develop over time as the technology got there. Because I think early on he was just turning on the thing and you just walked in. And I'd heard from Hal Glicksman that one of the pieces that Hal saw was also incredibly painful. He made a similar comment about the sound, the volume was very loud and made him a little uncomfortable.
Painful for Hal.
I like that.
Well, no, I mean, he had a long history of, he did this piece in this, kind of environmental art show at the County Museum that was outside in this sort of Japanese garden next to Shinonkan. And you know, they turned it off. The staff was driving the staff crazy. So sadly, I think that forming his work into something that could be a palpable and transmittable and a pocketable career enterprise. Saleable, and, or just even something that you could, you know.
A museum should.
Yeah, well, actually, I think later on he figured out different sort of strategies for that, and also that the digital age kind of brought to him, because he never liked the idea of using a recording tape. He wanted to either have a pure sound made by an electronic circuit board as a tone generator, or later when DOT came in and some other digital recording things, which he felt were true digital electronic notes that could be played through an amplifier. But prior to that, it could never be recorded, so it was kind of really hard to transmit it without a relatively easy kind of structure to do it. But
I remember one of the things that I read, he was talking about he always had a sine wave generator, and he did one piece somewhere around here where he actually, I think, set the table on the table in the gallery with the sine wave generator up, and he would sit there for a few days, and you could see he would try to get those waves right in this gallery space. I want to say it wasn't Caltech. It was somewhere in Los Angeles. But yeah, I think it was almost like a performance piece where people were coming in and talking to him about how he's constructing these things, from what I've gathered. But yeah, it was a sound wave with an amplifier, and that's he would sit there and kind of tune the room. I think as I described it, yeah.
I was wondering also, because it all mentioned the studio at one point or another, how much of the sort of experience of an installation space translates how he's working in the studio, and maybe if you guys can talk about sort of the.
Well, I worked in the studio on Navy Street, so I just remember putting hundreds and hundreds of pounds of drywall compound to try to level out the walls just right. And Roy Thurston put himself twice on a table saw. We had to take him to the emergency room. So I remember working on that, and we all thought Michael was slightly crazy, but all of us were. This idea of making the perfect kind of envelope, perfect space that he could, like a scientific instrument that he could use to try different things in. And he was very focused on that for a very long time, and kind of perfecting it, so it wasn't just the scientific instrument, but that it was, that it itself was its own kind of aesthetic space, proportionally. And it was like living on a ship, as near as I could tell from the outside, because he built this tiny little living space that was, like being inside of a boat. With little cabinets and tiny. I worked on a shower, which was a tiny little shower. And he had a tiny little machine shop and office, for his drafting room. It was just all this was tucked into like a closet, and then you come out into the main, main exhibition space, main experience space. Yeah, exactly. So, in fact, I used to kid Terrell because I made a piece called Whitehead in British Columbia that was like 6,000 pounds of plaster, and I told him that it was an isotope of his work. So it's like you take an atom smasher and crush it down around your ears, it would become this palpable block of plaster. He always thought that was a little weird. I also used to tell him that a really nice ripe piece of fruit, if you threw it perfectly right in the middle of one of his window spaces, it would atomize and completely turn this white room into a lovely, if it was an avocado, lovely light green. Michael, I mean, I remember the first show I did where I never really made objects that you could have shown in the gallery, much less buy them. I made ensembles and objects. And the first sort of show I did, it grew out of that, where they were actually individual works that somebody could purchase. I got a phone call from Michael, and he left a message on the machine. He goes, "Certainly not your best show." But at the end of his life, he said something really interesting to me, because at some point he said, "You actually have had a real career, where you've had exhibitions and museum shows and made your work." He said, I tried so hard to make what I wanted to do, but I had such a hard time getting it across or staying with it. And then he was teaching the whole time. So, I think I wish he was still with us there, at a particular time when a lot of people, age, are accruing, are receiving the accrual of eminence, and having opportunities to do things. I just came back from a beautiful show of Larry Bell's in New York after, and of course we all know him from his youth, but for 30 years he was just nowhere. And suddenly there was this huge interest in the work and a big, beautiful Doug Wheeler show. And Terrell usually gets all the credit, but honestly, Wheeler, in my opinion, was probably more innovative than any of them were in terms of suggesting possibilities for how you could experience and construct the space that you experience in terms of light. So, and Michael was around. We could have goosed him into some, some things I think could have been great. So.
I think like so much of this, for myself, of learning about the art scene here in LA, and also working in the city as an artist, like there's so much of the history that's fit into these kind of categories of like light and space, or West Coast minimalism, or finish fetish, and things like that. I'm wondering, what do you guys think Michael's relationship to the terms like that were? And I understand obviously there's things that you're talking about where you're not putting into certain things. You wish that he was more involved now, where you can get him into these things. How do you think he defined his work relative to these other movements?
Sound installation. I mean, that's almost a direct quote from him to me, was sound installation. Yeah, and I think and I believe in an interview I read, he said that he was and I'm quoting him, the bastard child of Maury Baden and James Turrell.
Because it's interesting that he has like a cohort, like Bird and Turrell.
No, I'm sorry, Robert Irwin.
Irwin, yeah.
Sorry, James. He liked you. You guys are buddies.
But some of those artists are working different mediums, and so I'm interested in like how maybe that, like these different types of groups of artists maybe influenced each other at that time, and how he thought his relationship to them maybe like influenced.
I mean, well, all the light and space guys. So Mike's, aside from that, in a certain way, but was growing up in the middle of all the light and space guys, in one way or another, were trying to figure out a way to dissolve the object, right? So initially, Irwin would have the dot paintings, which would all these kind of diffusing effects, or the discs on the wall, where the object would sort of go from an object and kind of just be kind of a bump on the wall, or the acrylic pillars that would look kind of like ice and water and the right kind of lighting, and they all were trying to figure out a way to diffuse it somehow, diffuse the edge of it, I think. So certainly Michael was in the middle of that process, but the relationship to Maury was important because Maury's stuff was always kind of about kinesthesis, so it was always about the body experiencing something. So as diffused as Michael still kept this idea that it was like, even if it's the clicker, you have these kinds of reactions to things that were always like physical. They weren't about Jesus, So they stayed very down to earth in that way, I think.
Yeah, I think down to earth is a good way to put it with Michael. Where I think that some of the other kind of classic light and space stuff, if you were just an eyeball, you could get everything out of the work, just like hovering around. With Michael's, you had to be a body, kind of plodding through space. There's a real kind of, to me, almost like this Beckett, where we're a bag of bones, plodding through a room, and that's where the stuff comes from. So to me, it's not as pretty, it's not as decorative. It's kind of, it's more kind of like crude. I guess if they're light and space artists, I think, I think they, the land art was a big deal at the time, and I think that Michael is kind of air art, if you want to make a category for him, and it's also kind of interior air art with body.
With body.
Yeah,
with
so
body.
That's
Air body.
Yeah.
I know like early.
Is there an acronym for that?
Yeah, I'm building one now.
Work on it.
Yeah. I'm starting a company.
I was gonna say, I know early installations also were done in landscape, and get done like sound installations outside, that were maybe more classified as land art. I'm wondering maybe how his approach to an exterior space maybe changed the work, or changed his approach to work versus like the really controlled interior space.
I believe the first sound piece that he did outside was 1977 for carp up in San Francisco. And this was done in a tunnel, Tarabell Tunnel, on Tarabell Street to the beach. The tunnel's no longer there, it's been torn down. But Michael hung a speaker at the end of the tunnel facing the city and made that thing come alive. And from the people I've spoken to who experienced it, you sort of passed through this just tunnel of just, these sonic envelopes, and you went from sort of one acoustic space through that acoustic space to the final acoustic space of the beach. And it had this beautiful sort of transition passage to it. The technical thing was, of course, how does Michael run an amplifier outside? And I think the way this was done was they either had a generator or they were running off of a car that was parked on top of the bridge, and the thing was just dropped down, and he would turn it on for 2 or 3 hours during the day, and then he'd turn it off. So I think in that piece, and then some of the other external pieces, he liked outdoor tunnels. I think he liked the megaphone aspect of them as well, and I think it was a space he felt that he could control. But I definitely think he allowed, I'm not sure if he was orchestrating the work to those environments as intently as he does his later stuff, but I find them very strong pieces. They're definitely interesting.
Yeah. But you definitely have like more variable play with something like that too, where you're sort of subject to the environment, where it's not necessarily something that you're authoring as an artistic experience, but you're also letting in its sort of randomness as well. I'm wondering, because the spaces seem so calculated in terms of like a studio or how he's reading decibels with this, how maybe his thinking differed between those things, or if he had problems with one versus the other in that respect.
I certainly know that I think he liked, toward the end of his life, once he built his final studio, he loved it there. From what I've read and from what he told me, he liked it. He could go in there, he could do far more nuance, he could really probe sound. And I think some of his, from what I've gathered, the earlier sound pieces where he felt that there was a slight, he wasn't confiding the environment, but he was working so hard to find the sound within the space, and maybe the sound wasn't quite as elegant or as rich as he would have wanted it. So I think that once he figured out the instrument, as the way you described it, he really liked to use that instrument. He cut out those variables, and he could focus more on just the material of sound itself and getting you in there and resonating, in that space. Kind of what I've learned, yeah.
Whenever I use the word discreet, that word always reminds me of Michael. So I don't know why, because he's an incredibly articulate fellow, if you all remember, eloquent and articulate and very well spoken. And but he loved to use this word discreet, and I just think, fuck me, that's, the way he would say it, it's sort of like somebody else saying, really, really good peanut butter or something like that. And so whenever the word comes out of my mouth, Michael's right there with it coming out of my mouth. I think this is a big problem with the sound thing for him. Always was trying to figure out a way to capture it, and it needed something to help scale it and sometimes form it. So obviously the tunnel. He did a beautiful proposal, which went nowhere, I guess, for Switzerland, going through a traffic tunnel that was going to condition sound in some way. That might, it's a little bit like noise cancellation, which was in its early days, and he had this idea about how he could condition the sound and make it different and palpable for people going through the tunnel. And I can think of all kinds of implications for the work that were. The problem is, like any sculptor, actually, is that you can put something outside and it loses scale. You think, well, and then you can just make it bigger and bigger, but making something bigger is not about scale. That scale is about a relationship. Yeah. So as long as he could keep a relationship to the participant or the person interacting, that would be good. Otherwise, it would get very diffused and would lose its discrete quality. So discrete was a big word for him to always be thinking about how to form something.
I like
And there was one really early work, I think maybe while he was still a student, that we had he gave a map to the faculty and other students to drive towards Baker. Do you remember this one? And then you were pulled into kind of a hill overlooking the desert. It was really kind of you were in the middle of nowhere, and you had to wait till sunset, and you're just kind of sitting there. I wasn't there. I read about it, and then and Michael had placed either speakers that made little sounds on the ground, or I think they were actually lights.
Flashing lights.
Yeah. And so you'd be sitting there, and then they kind of performed this I imagine it as kind of like, mechanical firefly constellation dance, and it happens for a half hour or so, and it's.
Well, you did a variation of that in the canals in Venice.
Yeah.
With floating ones.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is there any documentation for that? Pictures?
Yes.
There is.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. We do have the instructions of how to get out to Baker and these things. And it was interesting because we did some of the photographs. Actually, Maury Baden gave a fantastic description about he actually went out, and I asked him, like, did you? I said, yeah, I went out there and and described the sunset, and then as it got dark, and Michael just echoes Michael's comment that the lights would come alive and do that.
Do their thing, yeah.
As you put it, what did you say? Mechanical firefly. And then as the moon rose, they would get less and less, or they would appear to go less and less and less. And the problem, Michael said, was well, the problem is then people would walk down into this thing, and it would lose the effect. And he realized he wanted to get somebody into the work, and that was where the idea of the sound.
That was when he was still developing, yeah.
Yeah, the sound, the led in the flickers and the famous Chris Burton.
But probably his most kind of pictorial work that was meant to be seen from a distance.
Yeah, you're up there, you're looking down in these patterns, and they're all glowing. Yeah.
But I think like a lot of the earlier work prior to the Chris Burton's buggy that sort of propelled into sound, and a lot of it was light based, and so there was always that visual quality. And I think it's interesting seeing something like that where he's seeing those limitations and why he felt like he had to make that
leap into
sound. But I know that light still stayed in the practice in terms of like the spaces that he was installing. And so I'm wondering maybe if there's if you guys have talked to him or knew anything about how he thought about light as it played to sculpture in that capacity prior to moving to sound.
Well, I know he used lights. I think the first big piece where he really got excited about lighting was a piece called Touch and Go, where he actually had the capacity to change the electricity of the gallery. And you would come in and lights would change and sort of move you through the gallery as you're pushing buttons and activating the thing. So you'd push the button, the sculpture would activate, the lights would change, and you would sort of move through that space. I think, and this is sort of a hypothesis, I'm sure he decided that he liked the idea of dimming lights when the sound came on, so that way you weren't looking at stuff and you were letting your ears be more in tune to the environment. But that's something I think he developed in his more later installations.
Yeah, so I think if he were a band, he would only play live. And he's like, no, there are no recordings made. Because I think it was really important for him that it had to be an intimate connection between the experiencer, the listener, and
I mean, he was what, and there's always been this struggle to sort of come up with a transportable envelope for the work. I mean, Hannah's been working on that. The Ponzes were always working on that. I remember I would talk to him and say, well, what about, this portable refrigerators that they put up, these sort of panels, so that he could, I suspect that he could, again, eventually, I mean, I just saw this, if you saw Freeze, you saw all these very, not my favorite Terrell work, Freeze, of these sort of, but they look very portable, they did, they look like you could, yeah, exactly, they look very self-contained and, pop it in the wall and off you go, light that sucker up. So I could, again, some of those sad things about Michael not having, now at a time when there's, could have been some opportunity for people supporting the work and being really interested in it, could have figured out some ways to not that you make some sort of sharper image helmet or something, VR thing or something, but some way that he could have figured that out.
No, I mean, when I listened to it there, I felt it was a huge loss, having to listen to it moving into
the
that
space
realm of music versus when I went to the studio where the whole studio was a sculpture basically. I mean, that's the way I remember it, and it was very physical, and I felt that was a real loss to put it onto a CD or headphones.
Yeah, he would bristle when faculty would say, like, oh, you should be in the music department. And he was like, no. So I think he's with you on that.
Well, I mean, I used to kid him a little bit about the idea that he could make some things that he could attach to people, as in something you clip onto yourself for a few different places that would make you the activator in this. But, he didn't get angry at me about that.
Not your best fun.
It wasn't my best thought. Certainly not your best thought, Cliff. He didn't tell me he was sorry about that later. But I remember getting off the phone and I said to my wife, I said, Brewster just called me up. He left me a message. He said, certainly not your best show. Click.